Compassion and self-restraint are inextricably linked. Without self-restraint, compassion can remain only an emotion or idea that never affects our actions. Much human suffering comes from the assumption that every desire deserves to be satisfied. Craving comfort, convenience, status, entertainment, pleasure, and buying tons of stuff begin to feel like necessities. Self-restraint interrupts that assumption and asks, do I actually need this? What does satisfying this desire cost someone else? Is my momentary pleasure worth another being's suffering? And this question begins the moment of awakening when objects become subjects. Sometimes we can discover and understand our own psychological blind spots better when we view them in someone else who's got it going on another level. And certain aspects of the manosphere give us that perfectly exaggerated level of self-serving values and behaviors that societally is like looking in a mirror, whether we realize it or not. As a society, we've got lifestyles of extraction, abuse, and consumption going on that may well end the human race if we don't get a handle on it soon. And that lifestyle, believe it or not, has its ancient roots in the practice of herding animals, also called pastoralism. The first step in stepping away from the mess humans have created is to move toward a compassionate lifestyle which must be rooted in veganism. Why veganism? Because how you do one thing is how you do everything, and our inherited brutal beliefs and practices rooted in the exploitation of animals proves this. The old herding cultures gradually recast animals from awe-inspiring cohabitants of a shared world to mere property objects to be used, sold, confined, and killed. Under complete control of human hands, animals have been treated with increasing violence and disrespect and have become viewed as inferior creatures to be used and abused according to our desires. From handbags to cheeseburgers, we keep the rape racks of factory farms in full swing because we are insane and insatiable. As a culture, we really are best represented by Andrew Tate or maybe even Alexander the Great. To quote Will Tuttle in his book titled The World Peace Diet, the larger and more powerful the animals were that were herded, the more fierce, cruel, and violent the cultures had to be to successfully dominate them and protect them from marauding wild animals and people. The cattle herding cultures that established themselves in the Middle East and in the Eastern Mediterranean engaged in unimaginably vicious warfare with each other and against weaker people for millennia, gradually and forcibly spreading their culture and herding values throughout Europe and most of Asia. At the living core of this ancient culture that became what we call today Western civilization was the absolute supremacy of humans over animals, reinforced through daily meals. The role model for young boys became that of the successful proto-capitalist, the macho herder and warrior, tough, cool, emotionally distant, and capable of unflinching violence. Women, livestock, and captured or conquered people were property objects contributing to the total amount of capital. Wars, though horrific to combatants and the general population, were potent methods used by the wealthy aristocracy to increase its accumulation of cattle, capital, land, power, and prestige. The herding culture into which we have been born has sown in us the seeds of competitiveness, hubris, anxiety, and disconnectedness. We have forgotten that we are blessed by blessing others. By using, excluding, controlling, or dominating others, we become enmeshed in suffering and further enslaved to the illusion of separateness, which is the herding culture's fundamental orientation. In an essay called The First Step, written by Leo Tolstoy in 1892, Tolstoy talks about veganism, which at that time was called vegetarianism because the term vegan wasn't actually coined until 1944. Tolstoy states that veganism is the first moral step toward a more compassionate and spiritually awakened life. But the essay is not about diet or health. It is about ethics, self-discipline, and nonviolence. Tolstoy's realization is that if we wish to live morally, we cannot ignore the suffering inflicted on animals for food or for their fur or skin. People often seek lofty moral ideals while overlooking an obvious contradiction: that of professing compassion while participating in unnecessary acts of cruelty and inflicting suffering on innocent, defenseless animals. Tolstoy realized the connection between this violence and everyday life. He saw that killing animals for pleasure or habit dulls our sensitivity to suffering and makes violence seem normal. He saw slaughterhouses as places deliberately kept out of public view because witnessing them would disturb most people. He felt that moral progress begins with relatively simple acts of self-restraint. Before attempting to reform society or attaining spiritual perfection, one should first stop causing unnecessary harm wherever possible. He argued that mercy is not an abstract principle, but something cultivated through daily choices. Choosing not to eat animals or their milk or eggs was, for him, one practical way to strengthen one's capacity for compassion. He also viewed meat eating as part of a broader pattern of indulgence. Learning to master one's appetite, he believed, helped cultivate humility and self-control. An especially memorable section of the essay recounts Tolstoy's visit to a slaughterhouse. Rather than relying on abstract arguments, he describes what he witnessed in vivid detail to confront readers with the reality behind meat consumption. His aim was to bridge the psychological distance between consumers and the animals who suffer as their lives are taken. In Will Tuttle's book, The World Peace Diet, our culture's roots around herding animals is clearly defined, and I'm now going to read from The World Peace Diet. Most of us don't think of our culture as being a herding culture. Looking around, we see mainly cars, roads, suburbs, cities, and factories. And while there are enormous fields of grain and cattle grazing in the countryside, we may not realize that almost all of the grain is grown as livestock feed, and that untold billions of the birds, mammals, and fish we consume are confined out of sight in enormous concentration camps called factory farms. Though it is not obvious to us today as it was to our forebears a few thousand years ago, our culture is like theirs, essentially a herding culture, organized around owning and commodifying animals and eating them. It was roughly 10,000 years ago the wandering tribes in the Kurdish hill country of northeastern Iraq began domesticating sheep and initiated a revolution with enormous consequences. Anthropologists believe it was an outgrowth of the hunting practices of these tribes, who began attaching themselves to particular herds of wild sheep, culling them, and increasingly controlling their mobility, food, and reproductive lives. They eventually learned to castrate and kill off male sheep so that the herd consisted mainly of females with a few rams. From this, they learned selective breeding to create animals with more desirable characteristics, primarily fatter, slower, and more docile. Goats were domesticated soon after sheep, followed by cattle 2,000 years later to the west and north, and subsequently by horses and camels another 2,000 to 4,000 years after that. Highly charged concepts of property ownership and of male bloodlines and bloodline purity gradually emerged, of which there are ample evidence by the time the historical period began about 4,000 years ago. Our Western culture can be seen as having two main roots: ancient Greece and the ancient Levant, which is the eastern Mediterranean basin and Middle East. Reading the earliest writings from these cultures from about 3,000 years ago, like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and the Old Testament accounts of the ancient kings and their wars, we find that these cultures were oriented around slavery, meat eating, herding, violent conquest, male supremacy, and offering animal sacrifices to their mostly male gods. For the old herding cultures, confined animals were not just food, they were also wealth, security, and power. The first money and form of capital were sheep, goats, and cattle, for only they were consumable property with tangible worth. In fact, our word capital derives from capita, which is Latin for head, as in head of cattle or sheep. The first capitalists were the herders who fought each other for land and capital and created the first kingdoms, complete with slavery, regular warfare, and power concentrated in the hands of a wealthy cattle-owning elite. Livestock in the ancient herding cultures defined the value of gold and silver. This fact gives us insight into the political might of the ranching and dairy industries that continues to this day. By commodifying and enslaving large, powerful animals, the ancient progenitors of Western culture established a basic mythos and worldview that still lives today at the heart of our culture. Ryan Eisler draws on the work of many anthropologists to argue that there have been two types of societies, which she refers to as partnership or dominator. In partnership societies, men and women are essentially equal and work together cooperatively, and Eisler attempts to demonstrate that this was the norm for many tens of thousands of years of human life, prior to the expansion of patriarchal dominator cultures that were based on herding animals. This relatively recent occurrence, 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, was due to the Kurgan invasion by warlike herders from Central Asia into Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean basin. Bringing a culture in which men viewed women as chattel, they apparently came in three waves over roughly 2,000 years, violently attacking, destroying, and fundamentally changing the older, more peaceful partnership societies. These older cultures tended to eat foraged and gardened foods, worship fertility goddesses, make communities in fertile valleys, use metals to make bowls rather than weapons, and did not engage in war. The invading dominator cultures herded animals, ate mostly flesh and milk, worshipped fierce male sky gods like Enlil, Zeus, and Yahweh, settled on hilltops and fortified them, used metals to make weapons, and were constantly competing and warring. Violent conflict, competition, oppression of women, and class strife, according to Eisler, need not characterize human nature, but are relatively recent products of social pressure and conditioning brought by the invading herding culture whose dominator values we have inherited. Where did these patriarchal cultures come from, and what made them that way? Eisler cites the research of geographer James DeMeo, who ascribes the expansionist migrations of the Kurgan invaders and other herders to harsh climatic changes that set off a complex sequence of events: famine, social chaos, land abandonment, and mass migration that eventually led to a fundamental shift in human cultural evolution. Herding livestock tends to lead to aridity and to produce a vicious cycle of environmental depletion and increasing economic competition for ever more scarce grazing grounds, and thus a tendency for violent contests over territorial boundaries. The practice of herding animals produces the psychological hardening characteristic of dominator cultures. Pastoralism relies on what basically is the enslavement of living beings that will be exploited for the products they produce and that will eventually be killed. This would also help to explain the psychological armoring that James DeMille believes characterize the origins of dominator societies. Moreover, once one is habituated to living off enslaved animals for meat, cheese, milk, hides, and so forth, as practically the sole source of survival, one can more easily become habituated to the view that enslavement of other human beings is also acceptable. Moreover, once one is habituated to living off enslaved animals as practically the sole source of survival, one can more easily become habituated to the view that enslavement of other human beings is acceptable. The more forcefully we ignore something, the more power it has over us, and the more strongly it influences us. Looking undistractedly into the animal-derived foods produced by modern methods, we inescapably find misery, cruelty, and exploitation. We therefore avoid looking deeply at our food if it is of animal origin. And this practice of avoidance and denial applied to eating, our most basic activity and vital ritual, carries over automatically into our entire public and private life. We know deep down that we cannot look deeply anywhere, for if we do, we will have to look deeply into the enormous suffering our food choices directly cause. So we learn to stay shallow and to be willingly blind to the connections we could see. The acknowledged truth would conflict too strongly with our self-image, causing serious cognitive dissonance and emotional disturbance. We choose to ignore and thus choose to be ignorant. Being unwilling and unable to see, confront, and take responsibility for the hidden ocean of horror that our most basic activity causes to those who are as sentient and vulnerable as we are, we have split ourselves into a schizophrenia of politeness and civility that lives uneasily with the remorseless cruelty that surfaces whenever we eat animal foods. I believe this split is the fundamental unrecognized wound we modern humans suffer, and from it many other wounds and divisions naturally and inevitably flow. It is so deep and terrible that it is taboo to discuss it publicly." End quote. Until we stop standing over the world as its controllers and owners and begin to experience ourselves as participants in a larger community of life, we will continue to be dismayed by the human race's propensities for violence and our feelings of disconnectedness from life and from one another. The first step toward wholeness is a big one for some people, but nothing will ever be right until this step is made. Many spiritual traditions describe awakening as exactly this shift in perception. The Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh spoke of interbeing, the realization that nothing exists independently and that our lives are woven together with those of countless other beings. Tolstoy's insight points in the same direction. The first step is not merely changing one's diet, it is recovering the capacity to encounter the world as alive rather than merely available. Compassion then becomes less a moral rule imposed from outside and more a natural response to what we have come to perceive.